So witches. Yes, the pointy hat broomstick sort comes to mind. But before you picture cartoon cackles and black cats, let's remember, most of history's so-called witches were just ordinary people who had the bad luck of being accused of something they probably didn't do. Misfortune struck, the cows stopped giving milk, the weather turned sour, and someone, somewhere, decided it must have been her fault. It was never glamorous. There were no midnight flying parties, no bubbling cauldrons of neon green potion. Just neighbors watching each other a little too closely, and fear simmering in the background of daily life. And because humans are very good at pointing fingers, a whole tradition of suspicion, trial, and punishment slowly took shape, one that ended, far too often, at the stake. But tonight, we're not here for drama, we're here to wander, slowly, through the background hum of superstition, to trace where these ideas began, how they curled their way into law, and why anyone thought it made sense to fight invisible magic with very visible fire. So lie back, and let's start at the beginning, long before the first torch was lit. Imagine life, thousands of years ago, long before anyone had even thought of the word witch. No cities, no libraries, no handy YouTube explainer about why the sky was thundering. Just people, huddled together in small groups, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to lurch from blessing to disaster with little warning. The sun rose and it was good, the rains came and crops grew and there was food for everyone. Then, just as suddenly, the clouds might vanish for months, the earth cracked, the rivers shrank, people starved, or the opposite might happen. Floods sweeping away whole fields in a single night, animals drowned, shelters destroyed. When you don't know about jet streams, tectonic plates, or bacteria, your explanations tend to get creative. It wasn't foolishness, it was necessity. To live in a mysterious world, you needed stories to tame it. So across early human cultures, explanations bloomed like wildflowers. The earth shook because a giant beast moved beneath it. The sun hid its face because someone had angered the gods. Crops failed because an unseen hand had interfered. And behind all of these ideas lay a very simple, very human instinct. Someone must be responsible. If something bad happens, then surely it was caused. Things don't just go wrong by themselves. Someone, or something, must have nudged them. This way of thinking was the seedbed of what later became witchcraft accusations. Long before Europe in the Middle Ages, long before bonfires were stacked, there was already the suspicion that misfortune had a human shape. Of course, people also had specialists, the early wise ones, the medicine keepers, the charmers of spirits. Someone always knew which plants soothed a fever, or how to chant for rain, or when to plant by the cycles of the moon. These figures were not feared at first. They were trusted. In fact, they were necessary. A village without a healer was a village at risk. But here's the catch. The very same knowledge that set them apart, that made them valuable, also made them just a little suspicious. If you can heal, perhaps you can also harm. If you can call the rain, perhaps you can also call the storm. Admiration and fear have always been uneasy neighbors, and in those early days, they lived side by side. So the first whispers of witch belief weren't about broomsticks or black cats. They were about the unease that comes when people rely on someone different, someone mysterious, someone whose skills seem to dance just outside the boundaries of ordinary life. It wasn't yet a witch hunt, it was just the faint rustling of suspicion, like a breeze stirring dry grass before the fire begins. If you lived in the deep past, The world was not empty, it was crowded, though not with people. Every stone, every tree, every river was thought to have a spirit. The wind carried voices. Shadows at dusk were never just shadows. You weren't walking through a forest. You were moving through a neighborhood of unseen neighbors, all with their own moods, grievances, and habits. This way of thinking is called animism, though the people living it didn't have a neat word for it. They didn't need one. It was simply obvious. If a stream suddenly dried up, it was because the spirit of the water had been offended. If an illness swept through the village, it wasn't random, it was a punishment. Or maybe the touch of a restless spirit, or perhaps the mischief of someone who had learned how to bend those invisible powers for themselves. Now, most of the time spirits weren't enemies. They could be coaxed, persuaded, and appeased. Food offerings were left at shrines, charms were tied to trees, fires were lit at the right season. These were the original safety measures, the prehistoric insurance policies. Pay the spirits, keep them happy, and maybe life would stay steady for another year. But there was always the lurking suspicion that not everyone played fair. Perhaps someone in the community had found ways to force the spirits to twist their will. And if you thought your neighbor had a secret arrangement with the unseen, every small misfortune became suspect. Did your goats wander off? Perhaps she lured them away with a charm. Did your child fall ill after eating bread at another family's home? Perhaps their bread wasn't just bread. It sounds paranoid, and it was, but it also made a certain sense. In a fragile world, the line between survival and disaster was razor thin. Believing that someone, somewhere, might have tipped the balance, gave people both an explanation and a potential solution. After all, if someone caused the problem, then removing them could, in theory, restore order. And so, bit by bit, the world filled with invisible causes and visible suspects. Belief in spirits wove seamlessly into suspicion of people. It wasn't yet formalized, and no one was building bonfires. But the groundwork was there. A worldview that saw calamity not as chance, but as a chain of actions. Actions that someone nearby might have deliberately set in motion. Which meant the first step toward witch burning wasn't the fire itself. It was the creeping idea that disaster wasn't random, but personal. And once you've decided someone must be at fault, the search for culprits never stays quiet for long. Picture a small scattered settlement. Mud homes, smoke drifting from hearth fires, the faint bleating of animals in the background. Life is hard, but it moves along with a rhythm. In that settlement, there is often one figure everyone knows, the healer, the charm maker, the one who always seems to know which root eases a cough, or how to set a broken bone so it actually heals straight. At first, this figure is invaluable. You'd walk miles to see them when your child had a fever. You'd leave offerings in thanks when your leg finally mended. But admiration has a way of curdling into suspicion, especially when results are inconsistent, which, without antibiotics or vaccines, they usually were. If the healer's remedy worked, they were praised. If it failed, if the fever burned too hot, or the child didn't wake up the next morning, then unease seeped in. Had they given the right route? Or had they, somehow, chosen to let it fail? The same hands that healed could surely also harm. This suspicion wasn't born of malice so much as anxiety. In a world where death lurked at every turn, it was easier to believe someone caused it than to accept that it just happened. Blame has always been comforting, in a strange way. If you can name the culprit, then maybe you can control the chaos. Religion, when it spread through Europe, added fuel. Older folk practices, herbal remedies, charms, muttered words over a wound, were suddenly recast. No longer harmless traditions, they became suspect, labeled as unchristian, or worse, as dealings with darker forces. What had been tolerated for centuries began to look like a threat. And here's where a curious irony lies. The very people who kept communities alive through knowledge and tradition slowly became the ones most likely to be accused when things went wrong. The helper became the suspect. The line between healing and harming blurred into a dangerous ambiguity. By the time whispers of witchcraft began to solidify into something recognizable, the cultural soil was already rich with the ingredients: a world full of spirits, a need for scapegoats, and a mistrust of those who seemed to stand just a little outside the ordinary. The fire was not yet lit, but the tinder was there, dry, waiting and ready for the spark of fear that history, all too predictably, would soon provide. By the time villages and towns grew sturdier, with markets bustling and church bells marking the hours, the figure of the different neighbor hadn't vanished. In fact, she, or sometimes he, was woven into the ordinary rhythm of life. There was always someone who stood a little apart. The one who gathered herbs at dawn, or muttered to themselves when working, or kept a cat that seemed far too clever. Most of the time, these oddities were tolerated. People needed remedies after all, and a poultice that soothed aching joints was more valuable than an opinion about someone's eccentric habits. But tolerance is a fragile thing. The moment fortune turned sour, all those little differences began to glow suspiciously, as though they had been warnings all along. Let's say your cow suddenly stopped giving milk. No one knew why. You remembered, faintly, that the woman down the lane had touched the animal's flank the week before. You remembered that she frowned as she walked away. Was it possible that her glance had soured the cow? Or picture a child struck with fever. Desperate, you call in the local healer, who stirs together herbs and murmurs a prayer. The fever rages on anyway, and the child dies. In grief, your mind begins to twist the memory. Maybe she hadn't prayed to God at all. Maybe those words, those unfamiliar syllables, were something darker. The leap from eccentric to enemy wasn't a rational one, but then, fear rarely is. People began to look at their neighbors not just as helpers or healers, but as possible agents of misfortune. And once you start to frame the ordinary as strange, the strange as dangerous, the slide into accusation is a short one. This was the atmosphere in which suspicion thickened. Nothing supernatural was needed, just the ordinary human tendency to connect dots that may not belong together. And as the centuries moved forward, those dots began to form pictures that looked more and more like witches. Imagine, for a moment, the rhythm of village life. Neighbors exchanged bread, shared gossip, and worked side by side in the fields. Everyone depended on everyone else, until suddenly, things went wrong. Misfortune didn't arrive politely, it barged in. A poor harvest, an outbreak of disease, a stillborn calf. And in the silence after grief, eyes turned towards someone to blame. It was rarely the powerful. Landowners and priests were mostly immune to suspicion. Accusations drifted instead toward those on the margins, the ones with fewer friends, less protection, or quirks that made them easier to single out. That same healer who had once saved a life with her poultice now looked unnervingly capable of taking life away. It didn't help that folk healers often carried an aura of mystery. They knew things others didn't: how to boil bark into a bitter tea that reduced fever, or how to grind herbs into a paste that soothed burns. In times of desperation, this knowledge felt like magic. But when the cure failed, magic quickly looked like menace. Dry wit aside, it's a pattern as old as humanity. Success is applauded, failure is punished. If the healer succeeded, they were useful. If they failed, they were dangerous. And since medicine in those centuries was as much guesswork as knowledge, failure was inevitable. Which meant suspicion was inevitable too. Soon enough, rumors clung to certain people like burrs. Someone's bread rose too quickly? Odd. Someone's cow never seemed to fall ill? Suspicious. A woman lived alone without husband or children? Questionable. Each ordinary detail, when held up to the light of fear, became something sinister. The balance between trust and dread tipped easily. Today you relied on your neighbor's remedy. Tomorrow you wondered if she had been the cause of the illness in the first place. The same person could be healer and curse, blessing and blight, all depending on which way the wind of fortune happened to blow. If you want to understand how an ordinary villager could go from neighbor to witch, you don't have to look much further than the old, familiar forces of gossip and envy. These were the true architects of suspicion, quiet, relentless, and far more powerful than spells. Picture a village at dusk. Work is done, animals tethered, smoke rising from hearth fires. People gather, as people always do, to talk. Stories are swapped, laughter shared, but woven into the chatter are little threads of doubt. Did you hear about Anna's cow? Dried up overnight. And wasn't Anna seen arguing with the healer just last week? A small comment, nothing more than an idle remark. But in a place where lives are tightly bound, remarks stick. The trouble with gossip is that it grows. One misfortune becomes two, and suddenly the healer's name is whispered more often than others. The fact that she mutters strange words while mixing her herbs, well, that surely must mean something. The fact that she walks alone at night to gather plants, suspicious. The fact that her remedies sometimes fail, proof perhaps that she chooses when to help and when to harm. It didn't take much. A sideways glance, a sour look, a refusal to lend flour. These could all be reinterpreted after tragedy struck. If the baby died, then perhaps that refusal wasn't stinginess but malice. If a fire swept through a barn, perhaps it wasn't chance but a curse. The ordinary gestures of daily life became evidence in a case no one even knew was being built until it was too late. And envy played its part as well. If a woman's garden flourished when others wilted, if her hens laid more eggs, if she seemed healthier, stronger, or simply luckier, that too could sour into suspicion. Prosperity was a fragile thing, and in communities where resources were scarce, one person's abundance could look very much like another person's curse. It's tempting to think of these accusations as absurd, and in hindsight they are. But they also made a kind of sense in the logic of the time. Misfortune felt too sharp, too personal to be explained away by chance. So the mind sought culprits, and the easiest culprits were those who were already marked as different, those who stood a little apart, who carried knowledge that others didn't, who bore the unease of being both useful and unsettling. And so suspicion took root not with bonfires or trials but with whispers. Around hearths, in fields, in the pause of the market. Suspicion was never dramatic at first. It was quiet, creeping, half-formed. But as the years rolled forward, and as religion and law began to weave these old suspicions into official doctrine, whispers would harden into accusations. This was how the stage was set: gossip, envy, grief and fear turning ordinary neighbors into suspects. Long before torches were lit, the fire of suspicion was already burning, slowly, invisibly, in the minds of the people. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was not a calm, comfortable place. To put it gently, things were unraveling. Harvests failed, sometimes for years at a stretch. Winters stretched on, harsh and hungry. Plagues swept through towns, emptying entire streets. Wars dragged on, chewing through generations of young men. It felt, to many people, as though the world itself had turned hostile. When everything seems to go wrong at once, explanations are desperately needed. If famine comes, why does it come? If disease spreads, how does it spread? Without science to steady the mind, people reached for causes that felt both vivid and personal. Someone, somewhere, must be behind it. It was no longer enough to blame bad weather, or to appease vague spirits. These disasters were too heavy, too relentless. People needed culprits they could see with their own eyes. And who better than the ones already marked as suspicious? The healers, the loners, the odd neighbors with their herbs and mutterings. The idea of witchcraft, once a background hum in the village, began to sharpen into something more dangerous. It was no longer just that a healer might have cursed a cow. It was that witches, as a group, were imagined to be actively working against society itself. Not accidents, but conspiracies. Not one misfortune, but a coordinated assault. And in this climate of fear, suspicion became a kind of safety net. If you could name an enemy, if you could point to a cause, then the chaos of the world felt slightly more manageable. People would rather believe in a hidden plot than in the randomness of disease and hunger. A conspiracy, however dark, still gave the illusion of control. This shift, from personal misfortune to global threat, was the crucial step. The witch was no longer just a neighbor with odd habits. She was recast as a dangerous figure in a grand battle, someone whose destruction was not only acceptable, but necessary for the survival of all. It was in this storm of crisis, fear and imagination that the groundwork for formal witch hunts was laid. The fire was now only a breath away from being lit. For centuries, suspicion of magic had lingered in the corners of life. A failed harvest, a sudden illness. These were sometimes blamed on neighbors with odd habits, but it was still a fairly local affair. One family muttering about another, a bit of gossip passed around the hearth. It was dangerous, but it was small. What changed in the late Middle Ages was the arrival of a new, larger character onto the stage, the devil. Christianity had long warned of evil, of course, but now the idea crystallized into something very specific. Magic wasn't just suspicious. It was no longer simply meddling with spirits, or misusing herbs, or muttering the wrong sort of words. It became framed as a pact, a partnership with the devil himself. This was a seismic shift. If someone was suspected of witchcraft, they weren't just an odd neighbor anymore. They were an enemy of God, a soldier on the other side of a cosmic war. And if you believe someone is working with the devil, well, patience and tolerance are not exactly the recommended responses. Religious authorities began to feed this narrative. Sermons warned of witches gathering in secret at night, pledging themselves to Satan, performing strange rituals under the moon. Books began to circulate that described these supposed gatherings in lurid detail. Witches, people were told, did not just curse cows or spoil crops, they were part of an organized, deliberate rebellion against heaven. It was, in hindsight, a kind of imaginative inflation. The odd local healer became inflated into a member of a vast, terrifying conspiracy. Fear magnifies things in this way. Once you've decided someone is dangerous, your mind begins to furnish them with an endless list of terrible powers and sinister motives. And in the climate of famine, plague, and uncertainty, this narrative was all too convincing. Ordinary people could look around at their suffering and think, yes, this explains it. Someone is behind all this. Not just chance, not just weather, it's them. The witches. The devil gave shape to centuries of unease, turning whispers into doctrine. The suspicion of neighbors hardened into an official enemy, stamped with religious authority. From there it was only a small, terrible step toward punishment. By the late 15th century, the picture of the witch was fully drawn. She was not simply a woman with herbs, or an unlucky neighbor with poor social skills. She was imagined as something far more sinister. An agent of the devil, an enemy of the church, a threat to the entire community. This wasn't just rumor anymore. It was being written down, preached, and taught. Manuals circulated, the most notorious being the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches. Its authors, two zealous inquisitors, laid out, in exhausting, feverish detail, how to identify witches, why they were dangerous, and what should be done about them. Spoiler: none of the advice leaned toward kindness. To modernize, the book reads almost like a nightmare diary, full of wild claims and contradictions. But in its time, it gave authority to fears that had always floated just under the surface. Suddenly, suspicion wasn't just a village whisper. It had a theological stamp of approval, an instruction manual, and the weight of law behind it. Communities, already battered by hunger, disease, and war, now had a framework that explained their suffering in stark, personal terms. If the crops failed, it wasn't just bad weather, it was sabotage. If children sickened, it wasn't chance, it was malice. If armies lost battles, if storms wrecked ships, if fortune turned sour, well, now everyone knew who was to blame. The witches. And the solution was presented with brutal clarity. Find them, root them out, and destroy them. Fire was imagined not only as punishment, but as purification. Burning the witch was supposed to cleanse the community of evil, to send a warning, and to restore balance. Of course, before the flames came the fear, the interrogations, the accusations. But all of that would come later. At this stage, the tinder was simply being laid. The cultural ground was stacked with dry wood. Centuries of superstition, envy, gossip, theology, and fear, and all it would take was a single spark to set it alight. So the stage was set. Villages were nervous. Priests preached warnings. Judges were ready with their manuals. And the idea of witches had hardened from suspicion into certainty. The fire was waiting, just beyond the horizon. By the time witch trials began to gather steam, people were convinced they could spot witches just by looking at them. Not with microscopes or evidence, of course, but with a sort of social X-ray vision that was suspiciously flexible. The look of a witch was less about reality and more about projection. If someone lived alone, they might be a witch. If they had too many friends, they might be a witch too. Clearly charming people unnaturally. If they were too rich, it was suspicious. If they were too poor, equally suspicious. Too beautiful? Dangerous seductress. Too plain? Well, that was proof enough of evil lurking within. It was, in short, impossible to win. Ordinary traits could be twisted into sinister signs at the drop of a hat. That mole on your arm. A witch's mark, supposedly proof of feeding an invisible familiar spirit. That limp you developed after a fall. Perhaps evidence of the devil's touch. Your fondness for cats? Suspicious. Your dislike of cats? Also suspicious. Behind the dry humor of it, there's something tragically human. People looked for certainty in a world full of chaos, and certainty was found by making lists of supposed signs. Manuals and sermons carefully catalogued the features of a witch, as though misfortune could be diagnosed by appearance. The lists were detailed, yet vague enough to apply to almost anyone. Which of course was the point. In practice, the look of a witch had little to do with appearance and everything to do with vulnerability. Widows, spinsters, the elderly, the odd, the poor. These were the easiest to accuse. Their lives were already lived on the edge of society. To target them required no risk to the powerful, no challenge to the established order. So suspicion began with the simple act of looking, not at evidence, but at people. And once someone was marked with that invisible label, witch, every gesture, every misstep, every unfortunate coincidence became fuel for the fire of accusation. Witchcraft was rarely discovered by experts swooping in with magnifying glasses and pointed hats. More often, it began at the simplest level, neighbors talking about neighbors. Imagine the small tensions of daily life in a village. You borrow flour, but forget to return it. You quarrel over a boundary fence. You mutter something sharp at the market when someone jostles you. These tiny frictions leave a residue, and when misfortune arrives, that residue hardens into blame. Say your cow dies suddenly. The vet does not exist, the science of infection is unknown, and the loss is devastating. You remember, faintly, that your neighbor looked at the cow just yesterday, with what might have been a strange expression. Did she comment on its health? Did she mutter something under her breath? At the time it seemed trivial. But now, replayed through the lens of grief, it feels ominous. The same pattern unfolded everywhere. A storm wrecked a field. Surely someone had cursed it. A child fell ill. Surely someone had wished it so. Neighbors began to test these suspicions in small, informal ways. They might watch a suspected woman more closely, waiting for a slip. They might provoke her with insults to see if misfortune followed. If the cow of a man who mocked her dropped dead the next week, well, that was no coincidence. It was confirmation. In reality, these were accidents of life, stitched together by the thread of imagination. But when belief is strong, patterns emerge where none exist. One coincidence became evidence. Two became proof. By the time three misfortunes were linked, the gossip had already hardened into certainty. This was the first test of witchcraft, the court of public opinion, held at the hearth, the market, the edge of the field. Once suspicion lodged itself in the mind of the community, it was almost impossible to undo. Ordinary disagreements and accidents became a case file of invisible crimes. And so, without a single judge or torch, the process of accusation had already begun. A glance, a quarrel, a muttered word. All of it feeding the suspicion that witches were among them. In an age without microscopes, weather forecasts, or even the faintest idea of germs, misfortune didn't arrive quietly. It barged in, mysterious and devastating, and left people scrambling for explanations. A cow stopped producing milk. A field of rye failed. A child sickened and never recovered. In modern times, these would be traced to natural causes: disease, drought, bad luck. But in a world saturated with the idea of witches, each disaster looked like evidence. And once suspicion took hold, misfortune never stood alone. It always seemed to come with a story. Someone would remember that the accused woman had once refused to share butter at the market, or had muttered angrily during an argument. Someone else would recall that she had been seen near the barn just before the fire. Every memory, even the most ordinary, could be reshaped into a clue. It wasn't just big tragedies either. Everyday annoyances also became exhibits in the invisible trial. A churn of butter refused to thicken? Witchcraft. Bread failed to rise? Witchcraft. A horse grew lame. A hen stopped laying. A neighbor tripped and broke his arm. All of it could be pinned to the one person already marked as different. What made this so powerful was that it was self-reinforcing. The more misfortune someone was linked to, the more everyone became certain she must be guilty. And the more guilty she seemed, the easier it became to connect her to the next misfortune. It was a loop, endlessly feeding itself. In a way, it was a primitive form of pattern recognition, the very human tendency to join dots, even when the picture they form doesn't actually exist. People weren't trying to be cruel, they were trying to understand why bad things happened. But when the explanation becomes, "My neighbor is working with dark powers," the consequences are far from harmless. By the time the whispers had piled high enough, the accused didn't stand much of a chance. She wasn't just unlucky, she wasn't just disliked. She was now the embodiment of all the community's fear, misfortune, and resentment, and in that role she became the perfect scapegoat. With every failed harvest and every unexpected illness, the case against her grew, without witnesses, without evidence, without truth. Misfortune itself had become the proof, and misfortune was never in short supply. When gossip and suspicion swelled into something heavier, communities often wanted more than whispers. They wanted proof. Though what counted as proof was as slippery as smoke. In a courtroom today, evidence requires something solid: fingerprints, documents, testimony that can be cross-examined. In a witch trial, the bar was set differently. Proof, in these cases, was often about confirming what everyone already believed. The task wasn't really to discover the truth, it was to produce a spectacle of certainty. So authorities leaned on rituals and methods that to us seem bizarre, but at the time carried the weight of solemn procedure. The idea was simple: if witches were real, then surely they would reveal themselves under the right test. And so the logic of proof was twisted into shape. If a woman cried during questioning, it was a sign of guilt. If she did not cry, it was proof of unnatural coldness. If her neighbors accused her, that was weighty evidence. If no one accused her, it meant she was so crafty she had bewitched them all into silence. It was the kind of logic that folded in on itself. Any result could be explained, and every explanation circled back to guilt. Proof, then, was not about exonerating the innocent, but about reinforcing the suspicion of the guilty. The question was never, "Is this woman a witch?" but "How will she reveal her witchcraft to us?" And reveal it she inevitably would, because the tests were designed that way: impossible to pass, and brutal in consequence. One of the most popular methods of confirmation was the search for the so-called devil's mark. This was supposedly a physical brand left by the devil himself when sealing his pact with a witch. Conveniently, the mark could take almost any form: a mole, a wart, a scar, a birthmark, even a patch of rough skin. Witch hunters took this very seriously. Suspects were stripped and examined in front of officials, neighbors, and sometimes entire communities. Every blemish of the body was prodded, poked, and interpreted. A mole that looked ordinary yesterday might suddenly seem sinister today. But the test did not end at appearance. It was said that the devil's mark was insensitive to pain. So witchfinders would jab these spots with long needles or knives, watching for a lack of bleeding or reaction. If the accused flinched or bled, the examiner might decide it was normal skin. If she did not react, or if blood failed to appear, which can happen with shallow pricks, the spot was declared proof. Either outcome could work against her. For those subjected to it, this was not only humiliating but terrifying. A lifetime of freckles, scars, or harmless blemishes became potential evidence of a pact with the devil. And because bodies are never flawless, proof could always be found somewhere. The very act of searching guaranteed discovery. Communities found comfort in this. Here at last was a physical sign to cling to. They could point to a mole and declare, "This is it, here is the evidence." But in truth, the search revealed nothing about witchcraft. It only confirmed how willing people were to transform the ordinary human body into a canvas of guilt. Perhaps the most infamous method of all was the water ordeal. This test carried a simple, almost childlike logic, which somehow made it all the more convincing to those who practiced it. The accused was bound, sometimes hands tied to feet, and lowered into water. If she floated, it meant the water, pure and holy, had rejected her. Proof of witchcraft. If she sank, it meant she was innocent, though of course innocence came at the small cost of drowning. It was a test designed to produce drama rather than justice. Villagers gathered to watch, officials solemnly observed, and the accused endured a spectacle that looked, to everyone else, like a revelation of truth. In reality, it was simply the physics of buoyancy and the cruelty of hopeless choice. Some women did sink, pulled under by the weight of their bindings. If they were dragged out in time, gasping but alive, they were still considered guilty for surviving the water's judgment. Some floated, because air in the lungs and clothing can make a body buoyant, and this was seized upon as conclusive proof. The test was always interpreted in one direction, toward guilt. What made the ordeal so enduring was not its fairness, but its pageantry. It gave the crowd something to see, something to believe they had witnessed with their own eyes. And once the water had spoken, it was nearly impossible to argue otherwise. Thus, proof of witchcraft was never truly about evidence. It was about reassurance. Reassurance for a fearful community that their problems had an explanation, that their world made sense, and that evil could be identified and destroyed. It was a grim comfort, bought at the expense of those who could least afford to defend themselves. Suspicion could build, marks could be found, water could be tested, yet none of it seemed as convincing as hearing the accused say it herself, "I am a witch." Communities longed for this moment. They wanted a confession, not only to silence doubt, but to confirm that their worldview was correct. To extract those words was to make fear solid, to write it into the record. But why would anyone confess to such a thing? Why would someone stand before their neighbors and admit to dancing with devils, spoiling crops, or flying through the night on a broomstick. In truth, almost no one would, at least not freely. The hunger for words, however, was so strong that authorities developed ways to coax them out. Some of these methods were subtle, long interrogations designed to confuse and wear down the accused. Questions asked again and again until the answers grew tangled. Small inconsistencies seized upon as lies, silence treated as defiance. Others were more dramatic, hours without sleep, endless prayer shouted at the accused, or being surrounded by neighbors demanding she come clean. It was not so much a search for truth, as it was a performance, staged to wring out the words people wanted to hear. The idea was that truth must be in there somewhere, locked away, and with enough pressure, it could be forced out. But in practice, what came out was not truth at all. It was desperation, shaped into whatever words the accusers wanted most. In places where witch trials reached their most feverish, subtlety was abandoned. Instead, torture was brought in, with all its grim machinery. The rack stretched the body until joints popped. Thumbscrews crushed fingers. Ropes tightened around limbs until circulation failed. Each device was designed with the same purpose: to break down resistance, to make silence impossible. The cruelty was often disguised under a cloak of procedure. Records show interrogators noting the exact instruments used, the time applied, the confessions extracted, as though this was a careful science rather than sheer brutality. They reassured themselves that torture only revealed what was already true, never pausing to question how suffering twists the mind into saying anything at all. And indeed, under such pressure people confessed to impossible things. They admitted to meeting demons in the forest, to signing contracts in blood, to flying through the night sky, to kissing the devil's hand or foot, in grotesque parody of loyalty. Some described gatherings, Sabbaths, where witches supposedly feasted, danced, and plotted evil. Others gave names of accomplices, spreading the net wider with every confession. It was not that the accused suddenly believed in their own guilt, it was that the pain and terror left them with no other way out. To confess was sometimes to hope for mercy, sometimes to hope only for an end. And when the words were finally spoken, the interrogators wrote them down carefully, presenting them as truth. Communities accepted these confessions eagerly. They were the smoking gun, the voice of the accused confirming everyone's fears. No matter that the words had been dragged out under duress, no matter that the stories told were fantastical, what mattered was that they were spoken, and once spoken they could never be taken back. Confessions did not only exist in cramped rooms under candlelight, they were also staged for the public, woven into the drama of trials. Once a person had admitted to witchcraft, whether by coercion or by the exhaustion of hopeless resistance, those words became a script. In court, the confession was read aloud, sometimes by the accused, sometimes by the officials. The effect was powerful. The community heard their fears echoed back as fact. The accused might be made to repeat her guilt before a gathered crowd, reinforcing the lesson that witches were real and could be unmasked. These public confessions served more than justice, they served reassurance. They justified the punishments that followed, making the burnings or hangings seem not only necessary but righteous. They told every onlooker, your fears were right, evil was in your midst, and now it is purged. The tragedy, of course, is that none of it was real. The devil had not appeared. Crops were ruined by weather, animals by disease, children by illness. But the confession sealed the illusion. And for a society desperate to make sense of suffering, That illusion was enough. The theater was so convincing that it became self-sustaining. Every new confession fed the belief in witchcraft, and every belief fueled the demand for more confessions. It was a cycle that could only break when the appetite for it finally burned itself out. Until then, countless voices were forced to speak words they did not believe, words that condemned themselves, words that comforted their neighbors, and words that left us with the haunting record of a world where saying "I am a witch" could be the only way to end unbearable suffering. Imagine the scene: a cold morning, perhaps damp with fog, when the accused is led into a hall or chamber designated as a courtroom. It may not look like the grand courts of later centuries. Often it was a repurposed town hall, a church nave, or even an open square where authority could be staged. Yet whatever the setting, the ritual of justice was carefully arranged. The accused, weary and worn, might be brought forward in plain clothes, stripped of ornament or dignity. Around her, neighbors who once greeted her at the market now watch with guarded stares, whispering among themselves. For them, this is a moment of both dread and fascination. They have come to see whether the suspicions they have shared in hushed tones will be confirmed. At the front, judges or magistrates sit elevated, their authority marked by robes, seals, or holy books. They represent not only local power, but also divine justice. And they know their role is to provide certainty, not ambiguity. A clerk sits nearby with quill poised, ready to capture every word, for records were considered essential. Trials, after all, were not just about resolving one case, they were about building a library of examples, each one reinforcing the reality of witchcraft. From the moment the accused steps forward, the atmosphere is heavy with expectation. The trial is not a search for balance between innocence and guilt. It is a public performance where guilt is assumed and the purpose is to narrate how that guilt will be demonstrated. The evidence, if we can call it that, is presented in layered fashion. Neighbors might testify first, repeating stories of spoiled butter, sick cattle, or sudden fevers. Each tale is woven into a tapestry of suspicion. No single story proves anything, but together they create an aura of inevitability. Then come the so-called expert testimonies, witch-finders or learned men who claim knowledge of the dark arts. They speak with authority, declaring that certain signs, strange marks on the body, odd behavior, or unexplained fits, are infallible indicators of witchcraft. To the watching villagers, their words carry weight, not because they are true, but because they are said with confidence. Confessions are then introduced, either read aloud from written records, or repeated by the accused under pressure. Perhaps she has already broken under interrogation, naming herself and others. Perhaps she mumbles, exhausted, unable to resist the prompting of officials who guide her words. Each phrase is carefully transcribed, each detail repeated as though it had emerged voluntarily. Sometimes, spectral evidence is presented, visions claimed by the accusers, who insist they saw the accused appear to them in dreams or torment them in the night. To modern ears this sounds absurd, but to people then it was treated as a glimpse into hidden truths. The invisible world was thought to be just as real as the visible one, and dreams could be as convincing as direct sight. All of this builds not toward doubt but toward certainty. The structure of the trial allows no real space for contradiction. Even when the accused speaks in her defense, her words are weighed against the tide of testimony, and the tide always runs one way. The trial reaches its climax with the pronouncement of judgment. By this point, the outcome is rarely in doubt. Judges may pause, consult papers, or engage in solemn conversation. But the performance is less about deciding, and more about announcing what has already been decided. If guilty, as nearly all accused witches were, the sentence is pronounced in tones of grave authority. Sometimes it is excommunication, sometimes imprisonment, but most often it is death, for the crime is considered not merely against the community, but against God Himself. The methods vary: hanging in England, burning in parts of continental Europe, stoning or drowning in other regions. The spectacle of punishment is seen as necessary, both to cleanse the accused's sin and to deter others from following the same imagined path. For the accused, standing there as judgment is spoken, the moment must have been surreal. To hear neighbors, officials, and scribes declare with such certainty what she herself knows is false. To realize that no word, no plea, can break the web that has been spun around her. To see the machinery of law turned into a stage for fear, and to understand that the final act is already written. For the community, the judgment offers release. Their fears are named, contained, and punished. The trial has transformed anxiety into resolution. They can leave the hall, return to their fields, and tell themselves that justice has been done. But the deeper truth is that these trials were not about justice at all. They were about storytelling, public rituals that gave shape to invisible fears. Each judgment added another chapter to a grim narrative. Witches were real, witches were dangerous, and witches could be found among them. And with each chapter, the cycle renewed itself, preparing the way for the next accusation, the next trial, the next condemned voice. An execution was not a private affair. It was not carried out behind high walls or tucked away in some forgotten yard. No, it was a public event, summoned, staged, and witnessed. The community was meant to see it, and to remember it. That was part of its purpose. From early morning people gathered, farmers paused their work, children were pulled along by parents, merchants closed their stalls for the day. Word spread quickly. There would be a burning, or a hanging, or perhaps another grim method of ending. Few wanted to miss it, for it was as much a performance as a punishment. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of expectation. The space chosen for the execution might be a field outside the town, a square near the church, or a hill that offered a wide view. The stake or gallows was already in place, a stark figure against the landscape. Wood piled high if fire was the method, rope swaying gently if hanging was the choice. These were not subtle preparations. They were meant to be seen, meant to lodge themselves in memory before the condemned even arrived. Children whispered nervously, not fully understanding but sensing the tension. Adults muttered about justice, about cleansing, about the need for harshness in dark times. Yet beneath their words was unease. To gather together and watch one of their own die was not an ordinary thing, no matter how often it happened. The ritual made it seem necessary, even righteous, but the human part of them could not help but shiver. The condemned was led forward at last, flanked by guards or officials. Shackled, stumbling, sometimes supported because the body was already weakened by imprisonment or interrogation. For many, this was the first clear look at the accused since suspicion began. Faces once familiar were now pale, gaunt, unrecognizable. Yet the community stared, studying her as though searching for some mark of evil, some visible proof that she was different, deserving. In that moment the crowd became part of the ritual. Their presence was not passive. Their eyes confirmed the spectacle. Their silence or murmurs reinforced the narrative. Without the crowd, the execution would be only an act of violence. With the crowd, it became a story, a lesson, a warning. The execution itself unfolded, not as a sudden event but as a carefully staged sequence. Each step carried symbolism, each gesture was a message. To the people gathered, it was not simply the ending of a life. It was a ritual drama, a moment where order triumphed over chaos, at least in appearance. The condemned, bound or chained, was led to the chosen site. If the punishment was burning, the stake rose before her, tall and immovable, its base surrounded by a heap of dry wood and straw, arranged with deliberate care. If hanging, the gallows stood ready, rope prepared, the platform creaking underfoot. Either way, the instruments were not hidden. They were displayed as part of the message: this is what awaits those who stray. Officials moved about with solemn efficiency. The magistrate, perhaps robed in black, would read aloud the sentence, formal words declaring the crime, the guilt, the punishment decreed. Clergy were often present, for no execution was thought complete without spiritual framing. They would exhort the condemned to confess, to repent, to surrender to God's mercy, even as earthly justice carried out its work. Sometimes a psalm was sung, sometimes a prayer recited, weaving together fear and piety in equal measure. The condemned was given a final chance to speak. Some remained silent, broken by days of imprisonment. Some repeated confessions they had already given under duress. And some, though rare, declared their innocence one last time. Whatever was said, it became part of the performance, recorded, remembered, repeated afterward in taverns and homes. Assistants or guards then set about the physical tasks. If it was burning, they fastened chains or ropes around the condemned, binding her to the stake, arranging the wood in such a way that the fire would spread steadily. Torches flickered at the ready, held by those assigned to ignite the pyre. If it was hanging, the rope was adjusted, tightened, placed with clinical attention to position. The condemned's feet were often bare, symbolizing vulnerability, a reminder that she was no longer part of the community she had once walked among. The crowd watched in tense silence, broken occasionally by whispers, coughs, or the cry of a child. The ritual drew everyone in, forcing them to confront both the spectacle of punishment and the fear that lay beneath it. And then came the moment itself. The torch touched to the kindling, or the platform dropped, smoke billowed, flames licked upward, or the rope jerked taut. The crowd gasped, some looking away, others staring with grim fascination. What had been rumor, accusation, and trial now reached its final act: a human body consumed, erased, transformed into an example. This was the ritual's true purpose. It was not about proof, not about fairness. It was about creating a vivid, unforgettable image that reinforced belief. By witnessing, the crowd became participants in the lesson. Witches were real, witches were dangerous, and this was how they must be dealt with. When the flames had died down, or when the rope swung still, the ritual was not yet over. An execution was not simply an act to be carried out and forgotten. It was an event that had to be absorbed, digested, retold, and stored in the memory of the community. The crowd lingered, unwilling to disperse too quickly. Some stepped closer, peering at what remained, as though searching for proof that the evil had truly been destroyed. Smoke clung to clothing, settling into the air with a bitterness that seemed impossible to wash away. Mothers gathered their children, whispering warnings, shaping the memory into a lesson. Fathers spoke in low tones about justice and order, masking the unease that churned inside them. Officials took careful notes. The clerk recorded the details of the execution, with the same steady hand that had captured the trial, as if writing could stabilize what had just unfolded. Names, dates, descriptions, each detail entered into the record, each word reinforcing the narrative that the process had been lawful, necessary, and divinely approved. The written account would travel, copied and repeated, to become part of the larger story of witchcraft and its punishments. The condemned, reduced now to ash or left hanging lifeless, no longer resembled the person who had once walked among them. Her body had been transformed into symbol, an emblem of danger conquered, of order restored. Yet the human element lingered uncomfortably in the minds of those who had known her. A neighbor, a friend, perhaps even a relative, someone who had lived an ordinary life until suspicion had swept her away. The site itself retained its power long after the crowd dispersed. A field blackened by fire, a gallows standing stark against the sky became landmarks of memory. Children dared one another to approach, whispering that spirits lingered there. Adults avoided speaking too much about it, yet could not quite erase it from their thoughts. The community carried the image with them, reshaping it into story, and the story traveled further still, to nearby villages, to pamphlets, to sermons. Each retelling ensured that the fear remained alive. This was the true aftermath, not just the destruction of one life, but the reinforcement of belief for many others. Executions created a rhythm, a cycle. Suspicion led to accusation, accusation to trial, trial to punishment, and punishment back again to suspicion. The spectacle was not an ending, but a renewal. By watching, by remembering, by retelling, people ensured that the idea of witchcraft remained unshakable. For the individuals in the crowd, the memory would surface in quiet ways, in the flicker of a candle flame, in the crackle of firewood, in the creak of a rope in the wind. The executions seeped into daily life, not as a cautionary tale about false accusation, but as confirmation of a shared conviction. Witches were among them, and witches must be destroyed. Thus the cycle endured, long past the moment when smoke faded into the sky. Suspicion did not stay still. It rarely ended with one woman bound to the stake or one man swinging from the rope. Fear has a way of spreading, like smoke carried by the wind, seeping into every corner, settling into every home. After a single execution, whispers multiplied. If one witch had been found in the village, surely others must be hiding. After all, witchcraft was thought to be a network, a secret society of shadowed figures working in concert with dark forces. To root out only one was to leave the rest untouched, free to continue their hidden work. People became watchful. A glance that lingered too long, a comment muttered under breath, a quarrel unresolved, all seemed suddenly suspicious. Neighbors who once greeted one another at market began to study each other with narrowed eyes. Family members eyed relatives. Distrust settled into the very fabric of daily life. The clergy encouraged this vigilance. Sermons thundered about the danger of witches, reminding congregations that the devil was cunning, that he worked not from afar but through ordinary people. Neighbors, friends, kin. Magistrates too urged attentiveness, for what better way to display one's loyalty to God and order than by reporting a suspected witch? Each new accusation reinforced the last. Each name added to the list seemed to prove the existence of a hidden conspiracy. Thus, a single case often snowballed into a frenzy. The execution that was meant to cleanse instead planted seeds of greater suspicion. The spectacle had burned one woman, but in doing so it illuminated countless shadows. People began to believe the village itself was infested, that the devil's hand was everywhere. And once panic took hold, it rarely loosened its grip. Accusations did not remain isolated. They spread outward in chains, one name leading to another, each link forged by fear and imagination. It often began with the condemned herself. Under interrogation, pressed and pressed again, she might be asked to name her accomplices. Sometimes she invented names to stop the torment. Sometimes she repeated rumors she had heard. And sometimes, under unbearable pressure, she simply gave the names of anyone she disliked, or anyone she thought her accusers already suspected. Once spoken, those names carried the weight of evidence. But even without a confession, the chain continued. Neighbors swore they had seen the accused speaking to someone else late at night. A child recalled that another villager had once given them a strange look. Someone connected dots between misfortunes, deciding that two households ruined by illness must be linked by witchcraft. Each accusation demanded more investigation. Each investigation produced more names. Fear made the logic seem irrefutable. If witches worked in covens, as preachers insisted, then one witch could not possibly act alone. To find one was to prove the existence of many, and so each trial generated more suspects, more arrests, more confessions wrung from frightened mouths. The cycle became relentless. Entire families were accused, entire neighborhoods pulled into suspicion. No one was beyond reach. The old and poor were easy targets, but the wealthy too could be drawn in if their fortunes turned sour. To be accused was to be trapped, for silence was seen as concealment and protest as defiance. By this stage, panic fed upon itself. The more accusations were made, the more justified the process seemed. And the more justified it seemed, the harder it was for anyone to resist. To question the hunt was dangerous. It suggested sympathy with witches. Better to accuse than to be accused. And so, with each passing day, the chain lengthened. When panic reached its height, it no longer resembled justice at all. It became a storm, sweeping across regions, swallowing town after town, leaving devastation in its wake. In such times, hundreds could be accused in a matter of weeks. Courts worked day and night. Prisons filled with the bodies of the frightened, the broken, the condemned. Families were torn apart. Children testifying against parents, siblings against siblings. The pressure to confess was overwhelming, for confession promised an end to torment, even if it led to death. Communities convulsed under the weight of it. Crops went untended. Markets faltered. Fear reshaped every relationship, every glance. Trust became impossible. For who could be sure that their neighbor would not name them tomorrow? Entire villages seemed to turn inward, consumed by suspicion. Authorities, both secular and religious, fueled the storm. Some saw it as their duty, a holy mission to purge the land of evil. Others saw opportunity, power, influence, even wealth. for trials brought fees and confiscated property. Pamphlets were printed, spreading tales of witches, confessions, and lurid descriptions of their supposed deeds. These publications traveled far, carrying panic from one place to the next, igniting new hunts wherever they landed. The storm was not uniform. Some regions were devastated, others barely touched. But wherever it struck, it left scars that lingered for generations. Families remembered the names of those lost. Communities carried the weight of what they had done to their own. And the belief in witches, far from weakened, seemed only to grow stronger. Each hunt, each execution, became proof that the danger was real, that vigilance was essential. This was the cruel paradox of the witch hunts. They did not eliminate fear but multiplied it. The more witches were found, the more people believed they must still be hiding. The storm never calmed by its own will. It only burned out when exhaustion set in, when communities could no longer sustain the frenzy, when too many had been lost. By then, however, the damage was done. The memory of the hunts, of neighbors turned against neighbors, of fear turned into fire, would remain like a shadow across the generations, proof of how swiftly whispers could swell into a storm. Witchcraft, unlike theft or murder, left no obvious traces. There were no stolen goods to return, no bodies with clear wounds to examine. The supposed crime was invisible, hidden in the invisible pact between mortal and devil. And yet, the authorities demanded proof. Proof gave trials legitimacy, gave communities reassurance, gave the execution its sense of justice. But how does one prove the unseeable? The answer, tragically, was invention. The logic ran in circles, but circles are powerful things when repeated often enough. A woman accused of witchcraft must be guilty. After all, why would her neighbors invent such a charge? If she denied it, her denial was proof of how cunning witches could be. If she confessed, it was proof of the devil's hold over her. And if she said nothing, her silence betrayed her. In short, no response could truly free her. Guilt was assumed, and proof was a way of shaping that assumption into visible ritual. This need for proof led to what might be called a theater of evidence. Courts, clergymen, and villagers turned to a catalogue of signs, ordeals, and tests. They examined bodies for hidden marks. They dropped suspects into water to see if they floated. They pricked skin with long needles. They forced recitations of prayers. Each method was framed as rational, as orderly, as a way of separating truth from lie. But beneath it lay only the same certainty. Witches existed, and they must be found. The logic was self-contained and self-sustaining. To question the validity of the tests was to risk being accused oneself. After all, why would someone doubt the existence of witches unless they had something to hide? So the tests continued, repeated with grim seriousness, written down in court records as if they were unshakable science. They gave structure to fear, and they turned suspicion into sentences of death. Of all the methods devised to confirm guilt, the body became the most examined. It was treated as both evidence and battlefield. A place where signs of the devil's touch might be discovered, if one only looked hard enough. One of the most infamous practices was the search for the so-called witch's mark. Authorities believed that the devil sealed his bargain with a mark upon the flesh, an extra teat, a mole, a blemish. Midwives and inquisitors alike were tasked with examining every inch of a suspect's body, searching with intrusive persistence for anything unusual. If a mark was found, and nearly everyone had a freckle, a scar, a skin tag, it was declared proof. If nothing was found, suspicion lingered, for the devil was clever enough to hide his traces. Then came the needles. Witch prickers, professional or self-proclaimed, carried long, sharp instruments claiming they could detect insensitive spots upon the skin, areas where pain was absent, for the devil had numbed them. A woman might be pricked dozens, even hundreds of times, her body punctured until the pricker decided he had found the telltale spot. Bleeding or not bleeding, flinching or not flinching, any reaction could be twisted into proof. Other ordeals carried more spectacle. The infamous swimming test involved binding a suspect's limbs and casting her into water. The reasoning was as stark as it was absurd. Water, pure and holy, would reject the body of a witch, causing her to float unnaturally. If she sank, she was innocent, though often drowned in the process. If she floated, she was guilty, and promptly dragged out for execution. The community gathered to watch, finding reassurance in the clarity of the ritual, even though the clarity was nothing but illusion. Prayer, too, became a test. Suspects were asked to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly. A stumble over words, a slip of the tongue, a moment of hesitation, common under duress, was taken as evidence that the devil prevented them from speaking holy words. Exhausted, terrified, accused women often faltered, and their faltering sealed their fate. Each ordeal was framed as fairness, a chance for the accused to prove innocence. But fairness that begins with an assumption of guilt is no fairness at all. The ordeals humiliated, wounded, and terrified, while producing exactly the evidence the community sought. Proof was conjured from pain. To call these ordeals proof is to misunderstand their function. They were not truly about discovering truth. They were performances, acts carried out before communities hungry for reassurance. Proof was not found, it was displayed. The trials and ordeals offered a ritual rhythm. The accused was examined, tested, pricked, dunked, forced to speak, forced to endure. Each stage had an audience, neighbors who nodded, clergy who pronounced, officials who recorded. The very act of testing became proof in itself. After all, if so many respectable men had gone through the process, how could the result be doubted? The accused was trapped in a script that could not be rewritten. If she passed one ordeal, another would follow. If she passed them all, suspicion lingered, for surely a true witch could evade detection. To emerge entirely innocent was nearly impossible, for the system was not designed to release, but to condemn. Communities clung to this theater because it soothed their anxieties. The fear of invisible evil was unbearable. But here, in the spectacle of trials and ordeals, evil could be named, touched, displayed, and destroyed. Each test confirmed what people already believed. Witches were real, and witches were among them. The theater of certainty left deep marks. It scarred the bodies of those accused, and it scarred the minds of those who watched. It created an illusion of order, even as it sowed chaos. It provided answers, even as it destroyed lives. And perhaps most tragically, it allowed communities to believe they were acting justly, even mercifully, when in truth, they were feeding fear with flesh. In the end, the proofs of guilt proved nothing at all, except the terrible power of certainty itself. Witch hunting did not emerge from village rumor alone. Fear may have grown in the fields and alleys, whispered by neighbors and spread at the hearth. But to truly gain power, Fear needed words, carefully arranged, solemnly declared and bound in heavy volumes. The intellectuals of their age, the theologians and judges and self-proclaimed experts, became the architects of the witch craze, lending academic weight to suspicions that might otherwise have faded with time. It began, as these things often do, with a simple but dangerous desire: the need to explain. Medieval Europe already held a complicated worldview rich with angels and demons, with saints who worked miracles and devils who whispered temptations. Misfortune begged for meaning, and theology rushed to provide it. Scholars turned to scripture, to church tradition, to the writings of earlier thinkers, and began to stitch together a framework for understanding witches, not just as troublesome neighbors, but as agents of Satan himself. The clergy gave the witch panic its first true scaffolding. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of heresy and sorcery, shaping the imagination of their congregations. What might once have been explained as bad weather or spoiled milk was reinterpreted as evidence of a grand, invisible conspiracy. Learned men claimed that witches formed a counterchurch, a society bound not by sacraments but by blasphemous rites. To disbelieve in witches became almost as suspect as to be accused of witchcraft itself. Universities, too, played their role. Professors of law and theology debated the precise nature of witchcraft, not with the aim of skepticism, but with the zeal of confirmation. Was witchcraft heresy, or merely superstition? Was it possible to fly by night, or were such visions illusions sent by demons? The questions were phrased in ways that assumed their own answers. Each debate concluded with greater certainty that witches were real, dangerous, and numerous. This authority gave witch-hunting a legitimacy it could not have possessed on rumor alone. Villagers might gossip, but when judges cited canon law, when priests invoked the authority of St. Augustine, when professors compiled treatises, the gossip hardened into doctrine. Fear had found its voice in Latin, in parchment, in the solemn tones of men who claimed to be uncovering truth. And from these minds books emerged, dense, sprawling, confident. They would spread ideas farther and faster than any single trial or sermon. They would carry the logic of witch-hunting across borders, across generations, and into the hands of those who would wield it with deadly seriousness. If witch-hunting needed a handbook, the late 15th century obliged. Few volumes have ever carried such a heavy reputation as the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor with a flair for obsession, and published with the aid of fellow clergyman Jakob Sprenger, the book offered itself not merely as advice but as absolute authority. The name itself reveals its intention. Not a discussion, not a meditation, but a hammer, a tool for smashing doubts, silencing objections, and striking down supposed servants of the devil. And indeed, the book hit with weight. Thick with citations of scripture and church fathers, it dressed its fury in scholarship. To the casual eye, it seemed the careful reasoning of experts. To the communities that would read or hear of it, it became gospel. The Malleus laid out its arguments in relentless detail. Witches, it declared, were real. They were not only real, they were everywhere. They were not only everywhere, they were disproportionately women. This, the authors argued with grim confidence, was because women were supposedly weaker in faith, more carnal in desire, and more easily swayed by the devil. If that sounds like theological misogyny in its most barbed form, That's because it was. The text drips with suspicion of femininity itself, suggesting that to be a woman was, in some sense, already to hover dangerously close to witchcraft. Beyond its accusations, the book offered practical guidance: how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to prosecute them. It gave instructions on extracting confessions, rarely gentle, and advised judges never to trust a suspect's denial. It outlined the supposed powers witches wielded: the ability to spoil crops, sicken livestock, blight marriages, even steal men's virility. It stitched these scattered fears into a seamless tapestry of danger, and it offered the hammer with which to strike. Most chilling was the Malleus's tone of certainty. Doubt was not permitted. To question the reality of witches was to expose oneself as a heretic, perhaps as a witch sympathizer. The book provided no escape hatch, no safety valve. It constructed a system where guilt was the default and innocence nearly impossible to prove. The printing press, newly powerful in Europe, carried the book far and wide. It was reprinted again and again. Its pages passed through courts, monasteries, and universities. Though not every corner of Europe embraced it equally, where it took root, it flourished. Judges cited it, priests preached it, communities absorbed it. It became, for a time, the standard text of witch hunting, transforming Kramer's personal zeal into a continental phenomenon. To read it now is to see paranoia in its purest form, structured, systematized, made respectable by footnotes. The Malleus Maleficarum did not invent fear of witches, but it amplified it with terrifying efficiency. Where rumor could be dismissed, a bound book printed in Gothic script carried authority. Where uncertainty might have offered mercy, the hammer demanded blows. And so the book lived up to its name. It hammered not only on the accused but on entire societies, shaping trials and guiding tortures. It created, in ink, a nightmare that bled into firewood and smoke. The Malleus Maleficarum may have been the loudest voice in the room, but it was far from alone. Once the printing press began to hum with the business of demonology, it rarely stopped. Across Europe, scholars, clerics, and self-proclaimed experts produced their own treatises, each one layering fresh arguments onto the scaffolding of witch hunting. The result was less a single text than a growing library of fear, one that could be carried under an arm, quoted in a sermon, or consulted in a courtroom. In Germany, Johann Voyer dared to write in skepticism of witch persecutions, arguing that many accused women were deluded or mentally ill rather than servants of the devil. But for every voice like his, there were louder ones echoing Kramer. Martin del Rio, a Jesuit scholar of the late 16th century, produced his Disquisitiones Magicae, a vast compendium of everything one could possibly want to know, or perhaps not want to know, about witchcraft, sorcery, and diabolical pacts. His 6-volume work became the kind of book that sat on judges' desks like a reference manual, offering guidance on how witches might confess, what signs should be believed, and how the devil might intervene in ordinary affairs. France too had its own contributions, such as Jean Baudin's De la démonomanie des sorciers, a work as dense as its title, and just as unyielding. Baudin, a political theorist by trade, turned his attention to witchcraft with alarming vigor. For him, witches were not merely a nuisance, they were a direct threat to the state, a kind of spiritual treason. By wrapping witch hunting in the language of politics and stability, he gave magistrates further reason to pursue it with energy. England was hardly left behind. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, took up his pen and produced Daemonology in 1597, proving that even monarchs could dabble in the publishing trade. His treatise, written in dialogue form, left little doubt about his opinion. Witches were real, witches were dangerous, and witches must be punished. For a king to weigh in gave witch-hunting a royal seal of approval, which he would later demonstrate in person, during the North Berwick witch trials. Smaller works proliferated as well. Pamphlets circulated stories of local trials, each one retold with the certainty that the devil had walked among ordinary people. These were the medieval equivalent of tabloid news, short, sensational, and cheap to print. They carried tales of witches cursing neighbors, cavorting with imps, or meeting at Sabbaths. While they might not have had the scholarly heft of Del Rio or Baudin, their reach was wide, spreading fear through marketplaces and alehouses, as efficiently as sermons did from pulpits. What united these books and pamphlets was not only their content but their tone. They spoke with authority, cloaked in the certainty of theology and law. To read them, or even to hear them summarized, was to be impressed with the seriousness of the subject. They transformed witchcraft from rumor into doctrine, and they left little space for doubt. The effect was cumulative. A magistrate in Germany might quote Del Rio. A preacher in France might thunder from Baudin. A pamphlet in England might retell a trial, in lurid detail. Together, they created a chorus that sang one tune. Witches exist, witches conspire, witches destroy, and witches must be punished. Each text reinforced the others, building a self-sustaining cycle of belief. Books gave witch-hunting its backbone. They lent the appearance of science, the solemnity of law, the weight of theology. Without them, trials might have remained scattered, irregular, and inconsistent. With them, witch-hunting became a system, codified, justified, and terrifyingly efficient. And so the manuals spread, not just across borders but across generations. They sat on shelves, waited on desks, and whispered from pulpits, turning suspicion into doctrine, and doctrine into law. The flames of witch-hunting were fed as much by ink as by kindling. Panic rarely begins with a bonfire, it begins with a whisper. A rumor at the well, a murmured suspicion at the market, a complaint about milk that won't churn or bread that refuses to rise. Small, almost laughable worries on their own. But once the manuals of demonologists had given these worries a framework, once priests had thundered from pulpits that witches were not only possible but plentiful, those whispers began to take on an edge. A child fell sick, and suddenly it was not the child's weakness but a neighbor's envy that explained it. A storm broke a thatched roof, and suddenly the weather was not random but targeted. And because books and sermons had proclaimed that witches gathered in numbers, meeting in dark Sabbaths, plotting collectively, one suspicion easily multiplied into many. If one witch lurked nearby, surely more followed. Fear traveled like sparks through dry grass. These sparks were fanned by authority, a magistrate citing a learned text, a preacher invoking scripture, a neighbor recalling a story they had read in a pamphlet. Each voice reinforced the others until an ordinary misfortune, once accepted with a sigh, now carried the weight of conspiracy. What might have been dismissed as bad luck became part of a grand narrative. Witches at work, the devil near, the village under threat. The human mind, when primed, begins to see patterns everywhere. A dog howls at night, perhaps a familiar spirit prowling. A woman leaves the room when the butter refuses to form. Perhaps her gaze curdled it. People leaned in, repeated the tales, nodded gravely, and believed. And when enough people believed, suspicion hardened into panic. When panic took hold, it did not creep quietly. It spread with the force of a flood, sweeping whole communities into its current. Villages turned inward, suspicious of their own. Neighbors who once shared tools and bread now watched each other with wary eyes. Accusations leapt across fences and hedges like sparks from a fire. Once one accusation was made, others followed in rapid succession. It was easier to accuse than to stand alone in doubt, safer to join the chorus than risk becoming its next target. Soon, entire groups of women, or occasionally men, were named together. A quarrel that had simmered for years now found its outlet in accusation. Old grudges bloomed like weeds, fertilized by fear. Markets grew tense, with whispers chasing buyers between stalls. Alehouses buzzed with retellings of confessions from other towns, each story exaggerated, embroidered, and believed. Children, too, were not immune. They repeated tales overheard from elders, sometimes even inventing details, their stories taken with the weight of testimony. Authorities, faced with this rising tide, often leaned into it rather than against it. Trials were called not simply to judge individuals, but to reassure communities that the problem was being dealt with. Each burning, each hanging, was meant to drain the poison from the town. But instead, like bloodletting, the treatment weakened rather than healed. Fear was not lessened but intensified. If witches were being discovered, that meant witches were certainly among them. And if witches were among them, more must still be hiding. The rhythm of daily life broke under the strain. Crops still needed tending, animals feeding, but always with eyes glancing sideways. Friendships soured. Families splintered. A woman might accuse her own sister, a child their parent. The panic devoured not only the accused, but the fabric of trust itself. Communities lived in a state of suspended breath, each person wondering if tomorrow's rumor might attach itself to their name. What began in one village rarely stayed there. Stories traveled. Pamphlets retold trials in lurid detail. Preachers borrowed examples from neighboring parishes. Merchants carried gossip along with their goods. Soon, fear became contagious not just within towns but between them. One notorious case could set off a chain reaction across a region. A trial in Germany would be repeated in whispers in France. A pamphlet printed in England would be read aloud in a Dutch tavern. What began as a single fire could ignite a whole countryside. Panic, like plague, was not content with boundaries. Authorities once again played their part. They took neighboring trials as precedent. If witches had been discovered in the next town over, how could one's own village be exempt? Failure to find witches was not a sign of innocence but a sign of negligence. Communities competed, in a grim way, to prove their vigilance. Each wave of panic inspired another, each accusation feeding into the next. And so, by the 16th and 17th centuries, witch hunting was no longer a matter of isolated rumors. It had become a cultural epidemic. Regions endured waves of trials, each one leaving behind smoke, ashes, and lingering fear. The panic was never constant. It rose and fell, like a tide. But it always returned, drawn back by the weight of books, sermons, and stories. The chain reaction was self-sustaining. Suspicion bred accusation. Accusation bred proof. Proof bred punishment. And punishment bred more suspicion. Villagers burned their witches to feel safe, and in doing so, made themselves less safe still. The logic was circular, relentless, and devastatingly effective. By the time the panic eased in Europe, whole generations had lived under its shadow. Communities had been reshaped, trust eroded, and countless lives lost. What had begun as whispers at the well had swollen into a storm, written in ink, shouted from pulpits, and carried in smoke. When people today think of witch trials, the name that slips most easily from their lips is Salem, a small Puritan settlement in late 17th century Massachusetts. Salem was hardly unique in its fear of witchcraft. But the combination of isolation, strict religion, and a handful of misfortunes proved combustible. The story began not with learned judges or weighty manuals, but with children. In 1692, young girls in Salem village began to suffer fits, convulsions, screaming, strange contortions, and speech that did not seem their own. To modernize, these episodes might suggest illness or stress. To Puritanize, steeped in sermons about the devil, they suggested something darker. The girls accused local women of bewitching them, and once the accusations began, they spread like wildfire. Salem was a community already tense. Land disputes simmered, rivalries festered, and the boundaries between Salem village and Salem town were fraught with political conflict. When the first accusations took shape, these divisions gave them fuel. Neighbors accused neighbors, often those with whom they already had quarrels. The trials unfolded with theatrical energy, girls fainting in court, claiming to see specters, the accused protesting innocence, judges leaning heavily toward belief. In total, more than 200 people were accused. 20 were executed, most by hanging, one by pressing, a grim method of being crushed beneath stones. Others languished in prison, their lives shattered by suspicion. What made Salem so enduring in memory was not the scale. For European trials were often far larger, but the vividness of the records and the cultural echo that followed. Salem became a symbol of hysteria, of injustice, of how fear can warp entire communities. What had begun in whispers and pamphlets in Europe now found its echo across the ocean. Salem proved that the logic of suspicion knew no borders. If Salem was infamous for its drama, the German cities of Würzburg and Bamberg were infamous for their scale. In the early 17th century, these trials consumed entire regions with a ferocity that shocked even contemporaries. Würzburg, beginning in 1626, saw waves of accusations that quickly grew into mass executions. The panic was fueled not only by local superstition but by the broader climate of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that left towns anxious, starving, and desperate for explanations. Witches were accused of causing poor harvests, frost, and plague. Once the machinery of accusation began, it swallowed up not only the poor and marginal, but also the wealthy, the educated, even children. Over the course of the Würzburg trials, it is estimated that some 900 people were executed. Entire families were implicated. Children as young as 9 were accused of flying to Sabbaths or consorting with demons. A climate of suspicion so thick took on its own momentum, until even those with authority found themselves in danger. Bamberg too became a center of devastation. Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim presided over trials in which more than 600 people were executed between 1626 and 1631. He even constructed a special prison, the Drudenhaus, designed to hold and interrogate accused witches. Torture was routine. confessions extracted under duress were treated as proof of guilt. In Bamberg, as in Würzburg, the trials reached so high that officials and clergy themselves were accused, showing that no one was safe once panic gained momentum. These German trials revealed how witch hunting could become industrial in scale. Not a handful of individuals but hundreds were swept into the net. The smoke from countless stakes darkened the air, leaving behind a scar so deep that local memory would hold it long after the flames cooled. While Salem, Würzburg, and Bamberg capture headlines, they were part of a much wider pattern. Witch trials swept across Europe in waves from the 15th to the 17th centuries, each region adding its own chapter of fear. In Scotland, waves of trials claimed thousands, fueled in part by King James VI's demonology and his personal obsession with rooting out witches. The North Berwick trials of the 1590s, in which dozens were accused of raising storms against the king's ship, set a precedent for Scotland's grim efficiency in pursuing cases. In France, local panics led to burnings in towns large and small. Lorraine in particular became notorious, with traveling judges conducting hunts that claimed hundreds. Switzerland saw frequent trials, as did Poland and Hungary. The farther east one traveled, the longer the panic endured, with cases still recorded well into the 18th century. Nor was the phenomenon purely European. The mindset traveled wherever Europeans settled. Salem was the most famous, but trials and accusations occurred across colonial America. The belief in witches was not confined by geography, but was carried in sermons, books, and cultural memory. What united these trials was not only the number of lives lost, but the way they revealed the machinery of fear. Once a community decided that witches were real and numerous, evidence was easy to find. Torture produced confessions. Confessions produced new accusations, and soon the circle widened until dozens or hundreds were caught. Trials became spectacles, drawing crowds who watched as justice, or what passed for it, was carried out in fire and rope. By the 17th century, Europe was marked by the memory of these mass hunts. The trials left behind not only graves and ashes, but also questions. How could entire communities be swept into such destruction? How could learned men, priests, and judges endorse such horrors? And how could ordinary villagers, who once shared bread and greetings, turn on each other with such ferocity? The answers perhaps lie in the very fabric of fear itself, once woven tightly enough it is difficult to unravel. And so, dear listener, the flames at last burn low. What began as whispers at a village well grew into sermons, manuals, panics, and finally into the grand theater of the great witch trials. Centuries of suspicion, ink, and smoke, until reason, at long last, began to creep back in, and the pyres slowly cooled. But for you, tucked in bed with blankets drawn close, there is no tribunal, no restless crowd, no accusing neighbor at the window. Only the soft rhythm of breath, the slow drift of thought, the gentle weight of night. History's noise fades into hush. The voices of demonologists, judges, and preachers dissolve into the background, leaving only the quiet here and now. So let your mind loosen its grip. Imagine the fire dying to embers, the smoke rising once, then gone. There is nothing to fear here, nothing to prove. Only the long, slow slide into sleep, where even the darkest chapters of history soften at the edges, and the world is quiet once again. Rest well, my friend, sleep deeply, and know that, unlike in centuries past, You are safe from the whispers of neighbors. The only whisper left now is your breath, steady and calm, carrying you down into dreams.